In this lesson, we're going to take our hooks knowledge to the next level by calling a NASA API that will give us a picture of the day. We're going to build out our code so that when a user changes the date, the network request automatically reruns, and it's all taken care of by this hook that we're going to create. To get started, let's create a new file and let's call it usePicture. I figured that was easier than calling it useAstronomyPictureOfTheDay.js. So let's create a function and let's call it fetchPicture. This is going to be an async function that's going to use the fetch API. So to get started, we will wrap it in a try catch just in case there's an error. And we'll just console log the error for now. And in this try block, we will make a response variable, and that will be equal to awaiting a fetch call. And the endpoint is api.nasa.gov, and you can see it here. If you use demo key with NASA's APIs, it'll work, but you would never want to go to production with this because you would probably get rate limited. Next up, we need to parse this into JSON, and we just say await response.json. And after that, let's just leave that as is for now. This is like our network request function, and our actual hook will be below it, just to make it easier to read. We'll call this usePicture, like we named the file. And let's make it take a date in case they want to change what day they want the picture for. And to get started, most of the time when I build a hook, I think of it like this. There's some sort of state that I'm going to create, in this case picture, and set picture. And we will import useState. And then at the bottom of this hook, you're going to return whatever that state is, most of the time. In the middle is going to be a use effect that does something. And this is for a lot of hooks, but obviously they're all different and you might use different combinations, but this is what I tend to see often. So we'll use a use effect, and inside of it, we're going to say fetch picture. And we will give it whatever date they pass in, and we'll give it set picture so that it can set the picture at the end. Also, let's make sure useEffect gets imported. And it is. Okay. It's just complaining because we haven't given it the next argument. In this, we will say date. So what we're saying here is essentially every time the date changes, we want to run this effect. Okay. Next up, we need to come up here and we need to take our date and set picture. And at the bottom here, we can call set picture with the JSON value. That should be just about everything we need, except let's also use this date value. This API endpoint takes an optional date parameter and we can pass it in like this. We'll switch this to template tags so that we can actually pass that variable like this. So this should be just about everything we need. Let's try using it. So let's come over to our app.js and let's say picture equals usePicture. And for right now, we'll just say 2020-0505. And let's just console log it because we don't know how the response looks just yet. Make sure your server is running by doing npm start. You'll see down here I have it running now. And when I reload the page, you will see a picture object come back. Let's render something out to the screen with this picture. So let's close this div and let's just put an h3 with the picture title. Next, we'll add a div with the explanation that explains stuff about the picture. And then lastly, we'll render an image with the actual image source. And that would be the picture.url. And then we'll give it an alt just for accessibility with the picture title. So now let's see how that looks. Can't read title of undefined. This is because our picture is undefined initially until the network request comes back. So for now, let's just add if not picture. Let's just return, let's make it say loading. And now when we save, it should work correctly. Loading, and then it pops in. So that's kind of cool. We did a little hook that calls out to NASA. But what if we want to actually change this date in real time? Let's add an input field, give it a type of date. And if you're in Chrome or other modern browsers, this should work just fine. And then let's add a use state up here at the top, date and set date. And this is a use state. We will pass this date into here, and we'll take this and use it as our initial date when the page first loads. And now down here in our input, let's say the value of this date input is date. And whenever it changes, we want to take that value. We want to set it in the date state. So let's take a look at this now. Now we have a date picker up here at the top. And if I choose a different day, it just reruns the request exactly as we would expect it to. This is the power of hooks. We didn't have to really configure any update logic. useEffect just handles all of that for us. Whenever the date changes, rerun this. So that lets us, the consumer of our hook, use this however we want. Maybe we need to hard code the date one time. Maybe it comes from state one time, or we want to take that date from somewhere else. You have the full flexibility to do that depending on how you architect your hooks. In this lesson, we're going to start out with our lesson 5 code. So to get started, let's select those two files. Let's copy them and bring them into our current folder. Once we do that, you'll see what we had at the end of the last lesson. We're going to improve upon our hook in the last lesson by creating another hook. Let's get started by creating a file called useNetwork. This is going to be a generic hook for doing any sort of network requests using fetch. So to get started, let's make export const useNetwork. And since this does network requests, for right now we're going to keep it really simple. It will just take a URL to do a request to. Just like we talked about in the last lesson, we'll start out with some sort of state. In this one, we will call it state and set state. A better solution long-term might be use reducer or some other form of state management, but we're going to keep it simple for now with an object for state that stores loading and the data and possibly an error as well. Next up, let's add our useEffect. And inside here, all of the magic is going to happen. Whenever someone starts making a network request, we're going to set state loading true. This way our user interface can return a loading indicator anytime a request takes place. Next, we will make a function called makeRequest. Last time we did this outside of the hook to make it easier to visualize, but usually it's easier to just keep it in the hook itself so you don't have to pass variables to another function. It just has access to them. For instance, in this function, I will call setState. I don't need to pass in it as an argument because it's actually a closure inside of the hook. So let's start by adding a try catch, and let's finish the catch. If there's ever an error with our network request, let's set state with the error, and let's say loading is false, and let's rename this to error. And now inside of here, it will look very familiar to what we had last time. This will await on a fetch request with the URL that's passed in. And then we will assume that all of our requests return JSON for now. So we will say await response.json. And then when we get that back, we will set state with, let's actually call this data just to make it more generic and easy. Data, and we will also set loading false because the request is now complete. So now that we have that, at the end of our hook, we need to call makeRequest. And something to note, the reason we need to do this, you might be wondering, why doesn't he just do this? Why doesn't he delete this and just straight up do this? Well, the reason is that a useEffect can't return a promise. It's the way that it's made by the React team. They want you to return a plain function that returns a cleanup method in the useEffect. So if you remember back in one of our first lessons, we added an event listener for when dark mode changed. We would need to clean that up. In this instance, we don't need to clean anything up, but because of this design decision, you cannot return a promise right here at the top level. So we have to create that wrapper that I have right here. So we're almost finished. Let's just add a dependency here. Whenever the URL changes, we want to remake the request, and then we want to return the state right here. With that in place, we can actually go update our usePicture and get rid of some of its code, which I think you will find makes it a lot cleaner and easier to read through our usePicture code. So now when we come into this, we can obviously delete all of this. We also don't need useEffect anymore because our useNetwork handles that part for us. We don't need a useState because our network request does that as well. So let's just do this. Let's say data and loading. That's coming from useNetwork. And the URL for that is what we just had before. And then down here, let's keep a similar API. So we'll say the picture is data, and we will also give back whether it's loading or not. So now when we come back to our app.js, we just have to tweak it slightly since we are now returning an object instead of just that picture object on the root. So we'll come back in here and we'll say picture, comma, loading. And then we can change this to say if we're loading, return that loading indicator. Otherwise, everything should work just the same. So there's an error. And that's because when we first render, loading is not true and there's no product. We can fix this easily just by saying loading true when this hook is first mounted. Now when we come back, it works just like we would expect. We also get another cool thing. If we choose a date, it will say loading in between. So if the request takes a while, you can actually put a loading indicator. So now you'll see how we composed our hooks. We have two hooks in the top level of our app, our useState, which passes the date to our usePicture. In our usePicture, we're really just calling useNetwork. There's not really anything else going on, but maybe we would want to do something else. But even if we didn't, I think this is a good abstraction. If we want to use this picture in multiple places, we can, and we don't need to copy and paste the URL for this request. So if I was building an application with a lot of NASA APIs, I would probably make a hook for every NASA endpoint that looks just like this, all of them using my useNetwork that we just created. It may be a little fuzzy, especially if you're new, but I hope you're starting to see the real power of composing your hooks. If you're familiar to React, you always want to compose components, and really we want to treat hooks the same way. Start out with a base hook that's then used by your other hooks to easily abstract your logic in an easily readable way. Before we get into our main project, let's make one last hook for fun. This one's going to be called useStorage. It'll act exactly like a useState, except it's going to persist everything to local storage. So whatever you end up doing in your app, you can refresh the page and the state will persist. To get started, let's create a file called useStorage.js. We'll do what we've been doing and export a const called useStorage. And then we'll put a useState in here. And we'll just call it state and set state since it's generic. Let's take an initial state from this hook so that it mimics the useState API, and let's pass it into here. And then down below, let's return state and set state. So right now we're really just passing through the useState hook, but let's just hook it up in our app.js so that it's ready. So now let's call it count and set count, and that will use useStorage. And we'll say the count is initially 0. Now in here we will just put the count variable. Let's just put the count is, and then whenever we click this, we will increment it. So we will add an onClick handler with a callback, and we will say set count, count plus 1. So let's save that and take a look, and let's see if it works. It does, but if we refresh, it goes away exactly as we expect because we haven't done the work yet to persist stuff. So what do we do next? The first thing might be to actually handle saving to local storage. So instead of passing set state right through as the second parameter to this array, let's add a callback that wraps it. So let's just say state, and inside of this function, we're going to call set state. So right now it doesn't do anything extra, but what we need to do is we'll call local storage set item, and we're going to give it whatever state they pass in. We also need to give it a key. So maybe we should change this storage API to take a key as the first parameter. This will be the key in local storage that we set and restore from. So if I do that, and then if I come back over here, we will call this count. Now we can come over to Chrome. I'll click and we'll see it still doesn't persist, but if I go over to the application tab in Chrome, you should see our count here with whatever we had stored. If I click again, you'll see it changing in real time. With that in place, the only thing left is to actually restore the state. We can do that with a use effect. So let's make a normal use effect, and we will just run this whenever the component is mounted, and we're basically going to run it if the key ever changes. So if you change the key from count to something else, it's going to rerun this effect. Let's say existing state is equal to local storage dot get item key. So we want to use the same key, in this case count when we get it and count when we set. And now we can say if existing state, we will set state, and we need to JSON parse this state in case it's an object. And down here we need to do the same thing, well, the opposite, because this local storage API only takes a string. So if we're using an object, we need to call JSON stringify to change our object into a string and parse it whenever we need to grab it. So let's take a look at this now. We see that the count is 7. So we refresh, we click it more, refresh again, you'll see that it stays as 11. So just like that, we have a persistence hook. Before we go to the next lesson, I would encourage you to look up the new spec that's going to be replacing the local storage API. Chrome has released a key value store API that's supposed to be a lot better. The problem with using local storage and using it directly is that it works slightly differently in certain browsers, and it also blocks the main thread while you're saving and getting stuff from it. Another thing to note, this basic hook doesn't take into account when we're loading out of storage. It's going to render with our initial state first, even if there was something in storage, because it takes a split second for this use effect to happen. So there's some little things you could do to improve upon this if you want to.